right, Lecture 5 of Fetal Circulation. Let's remind ourselves of what's happened in the previous 4. Let's just summarize fetal circulation then. Remember that all of the different routing of blood was for one major purpose. That was to get oxygen and other resources from the placenta to all parts of the body. But in special, we were trying to get the most or the best oxygenated blood to the brain and the upper part of the body. Sense organs and the brain and other complex structures of the nervous system require constant oxygenation, and that oxygen delivery is most critical at that end of the human body. So we have shown in the last 4 lectures how that occurs, how you can get this fully oxygenated blood from the umbilical vein through the systemic veins like the inferior vena cava, through the heart, up through the aortic arch, and off to the brain. So we had 5 structures that were special. The umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein, the ductus venosus, the foramen ovale, and the ductus arteriosus. So what we do need to realize, though, is that although we do get the best blood possible up to the aortic arch and onto the brain, most of the blood in the human body, in the fetal body, is never fully oxygenated. Once the blood has passed through the ductus venosus and the liver, all of this great blood becomes degraded by dilutions. It's diluted in the liver, it's diluted in the inferior vena cava, it's diluted in the left atrium and the right atrium. So if you look at a diagram like this, you can see that the only blood that is fully oxygenated, that is bright red, is the blood in the umbilical vein, that large red tube coming back from the placenta. Nowhere else do you see fully red or fully oxygenated blood. What makes up for that? Does a fetus just survive on poorer blood, or is there something else going on? And there is. Let's mention one more thing before we wrap this all up, and that is that the fetal heart rate is actually much faster than you or I. Fetal heart rate is almost double. I don't know if you know what the heart rate is for a child in utero, but it's somewhere about 125 to 140 beats per minute. And that's double the resting rate of you or I. And of course, that faster beating means that more blood is being pumped more quickly. And although the blood is carrying slightly less oxygen than it would in you or I, at least in our general systemic circulation, the increased speed means that there's more oxygen per minute being delivered. So although the blood is carrying less per amount of blood, more blood is arriving. And so that makes up for that lower oxygenation. If I was trying to get a certain number of goods shipped through my trucks to a grocery store or a supermarket, I could send it in large quantities in trucks that would arrive more slowly, or I could send it in smaller trucks that I was sending more rapidly. Either way, I could get the same number of goods to the store. So, fetal heart rate makes up for some of the lower oxygenation in the bloodstream. So I want to keep that in mind. And then lastly, let's talk about what changes take place at birth. Because here we have a system that is meant to function outside the womb, but it has these bypasses in it. And those are not going to be good once you're born. We don't want blood rerouting. And so we're hoping that all of these go away, if you will. All of the major changes that happen in birth, though, are going to come about because something happens that has never happened before, and it's going to change the dynamics of circulation. So this child has been living in its mother's womb for 9 months. What is it that takes place at the moment of birth that has not happened in the last 9 months? And that, of course, is the first breath. The child takes its first breath. It's interesting that everybody in the room, in a sense, is holding their breath, waiting for the child to take its first breath. That first breath changes everything. Of course, the umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein, once the child is breathing on its own, those are going to be clamped and cut, and so will provide little usefulness anymore. Blood can still make its way partway through the umbilical arteries. In fact, a short segment of them continues to feed blood to the urinary bladder, which they pass right next to. But of course, without any blood going out, there's no blood coming back. The umbilical vein that would be leading back into the body is, of course, now not going to have anything to it. The vessels, in a sense, degenerate. They don't disappear. But you know from our study of blood vessels that the tunica externa is dense connective tissue, and that connective tissue will remain even though the tube is useless. And in many cases, this connective tissue is there to hold other things together. So if we want to go through our 5 objects and find out what's happened. The umbilical arteries have limited use just to the urinary bladder. The umbilical vein has basically no use other than, if you could see this in reality, if you look at the liver in the picture, you see it's in 2 pieces. And there's some connective tissue running right down the center of the liver, holding it up high in the abdominal cavity. Part of what's holding that up is the connective tissues of the umbilical vein. And it's going to continue, that connective tissue will continue to remain there and help support the liver high in the abdominal cavity. Let's turn our attention to the heart and lungs, because this is where things really change. In the dynamics of the heart here, these are the 2 things we want. We want the ductus arteriosus to close and the foramen ovale to close. So, what's happening right before that? Right before that, we have everything open. The pressure in the left atrium of the heart is low. The pressure in the right atrium of the heart is higher. Now, why is there this dynamic? Because this dynamic is what's going to be responsible for helping blood to move from the right atrium over into the left through that foramen ovale. And of course, the pressure is lower because most of the blood in the pulmonary circuit is going out through the ductus arteriosus and out into the aortic arch. What is interesting is that both the aorta and the pulmonary trunk are pumping out into the aorta. But in terms of pulmonary circulation, notice that the lungs are not open. They've never inflated yet. They're constricted. And so blood flow out through the lungs and back is low. There is some oxygen going there. Notice that the blood going to the lungs is not blue. It's just a darker purple color. But with not so much blood flowing through the lungs and back to the left atrium, there's less blood in the left atrium than there is in the right. And so with those pressure dynamics, it's easier for blood to move from the right atrium to the left atrium through the foramen ovale. And it's actually this pressure differential that keeps the foramen ovale open. Okay? So there's little circulation through the lungs. Now, at the moment of birth, the same hormones that have been stimulating contractions in the mother have been able to circulate into the child. Those are causing constriction in the ductus arteriosus. The ductus arteriosus then, in the next moment, is going to close, and that's going to change the pressure dynamics that we've dictated here. If the ductus arteriosus closes and does not allow blood to flow into the aorta from the pulmonary trunk, all that blood is going to have to go through the lungs, and that's going to change the pressure dynamics. Let's see what that would look like. So, at the moment of birth, after the child has begun to breathe, everything changes. And of course, the pressure here is then going to be high in the right side or on the left side and lower on the right side. And this is going to come about, and this will cause the foramen ovale to close. Of course, all of that is dependent upon whether the ductus arteriosus closes. As the muscles in it are tightening up, as it's spasming a little bit, it's preparing to close. And it's this first breath that's going to do that. The moment the child breathes its first breath, the lungs open up wide. When the lungs open up wide, the blood from the pulmonary trunk is drawn immediately over into the lungs instead of into the ductus arteriosus. That takes an enormous pressure off the ductus arteriosus. Its tunica media, its smooth muscle, constricts and closes, tightens up and closes that ductus arteriosus. And now all of the blood from the right-hand side of the heart is flowing out into the lungs and back. All of that blood is flowing oxygenated back to the left atrium. Now the pressure in the left atrium is very high. Think again, it's very easy for the right side to pump the blood just next door and back. The lungs are now wide open. There's very little resistance to blood flow. So the pressure is very high, and there's a huge amount of blood coming back to the left atrium. And that higher pressure is going to push against the foramen ovale and cause it to close. So the point here is that the ductus arteriosus closes. That changes the pressure dynamics in the lungs and in the left atrium, and that pressure then is going to close the foramen ovale, not permanently, but with every beat. As long as pressure in the left atrium is higher than the right, that pressure is going to close the foramen ovale. And little by little over time, as it remains closed, that foramen ovale is going to slowly heal over and form a complete solid wall there. But although that is what normally happens, it doesn't happen in every case. And Some human beings, that never heals. With every beat of their heart, it's closed. It might be open momentarily in between beats, but it doesn't harm the individual as long as these pressure dynamics that you see here remain in place. If something was to ever impede pulmonary circulation and pressure in the left atrium was to become lower, then the foramen ovale could pose a problem in that person. But it's not typical, and there are people that live well into their 70s, 80s, and 90s with what is called a patent foramen ovale, with an open foramen ovale, and it doesn't hurt them. They live full, complete lives. Anyway, it's really the ductus arteriosus that is the major change here. Now, problems could include the ductus arteriosus doesn't close, so blood continues to flow from the pulmonary trunk over to the aorta. The aorta then, at least from the arch down, is pumping both oxygenated, a blend of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. With that the case, if blood is escaping through the ductus arteriosus, there's a reduced amount of flow through the lungs. The left side isn't getting as much blood. Some of the blood from the right atrium can move right over into the left. So all of these dynamics can cause huge problems. And that's what happens. Some children are born, we say they're blue babies, or cyanotic is the technical term, because their blood is not getting fully oxygenated. One of the first things that happens when a child is born is it's immediately evaluated by a nurse or the doctor and given what's called an APGAR score. That APGAR score is rating a number of factors, one of which is what does the oxygenation of the blood look like through their skin. And if the child does not have a bright pinkish color to its skin, then there is likely some problem here in the heart. It could be that the foramen ovale was not formed properly, and that there is just a hole there between the two atria, one that can't close because the tube didn't, the foramen ovale didn't form into a tube, it just remained a hole. Anything like that can cause major problems here. So these are the most important dynamics, is that the ductus arteriosus close. If it closes and the foramen ovale is formed right, then the pressure changes that you see in this diagram are going to solve all of those cardiovascular issues in and around the heart and the lungs. Okay. So, the third major bypass, the ductus venosus, may take its own time to close. Remember, it's a vein, not an artery. The ductus arteriosus, being an artery, has a thicker tunica media. The muscle in there constricts and closes the tube. But since the ductus venosus is a vein, it doesn't have as much smooth muscle, and so it takes some time. The closing of the ductus venosus is not as critical as the other two. If anything happens with the ductus arteriosus or the foramen ovale that's not good, then you have major oxygenation problems. We don't have oxygenation problems with the ductus venosus, but we don't want blood to bypass the liver either. And one of the things here is if the ductus venosus remains open, then blood from the digestive system can flow around the liver and cause blood to bypass the processing of the liver. And if the liver isn't processing the blood, then there are some waste products and some other things that should be chemically treated by the liver, and that doesn't happen. So the ductus venosus should close, but sometimes takes a day or two. In the meantime, if blood is bypassing the liver, one of those waste products that should be handled by the liver can often build up in sufficient quantities in the blood to make itself known in the color of a child's skin. And this is what is known as infantile jaundice. Jaundice is a condition where waste products in the blood that should be processed by the liver don't get processed. They build up. They have a yellow sort of color to them, and the skin begins to take on a very yellow color. In the newborn infant, when we see that, we know that the ductus venosus has not closed as quickly as it should have. Luckily, the way to handle these waste products is very simple. Even in ancient days, people knew how to handle this, and they would simply put their child in the sunlight for a short time each day. And it turns out that the sunlight, the ultraviolet radiation that can penetrate your skin, is capable of breaking down these waste products. And so the child that's in the sun a little bit every day will have these waste products broken down while the ductus venosus is closing. Once it's closed and all the blood from the digestive system flows through the processing structures of the liver, then this isn't a problem. In the hospital these days, we don't put the child out in the sun, but they have special ultraviolet lights that they call Billy lights. And these Billy lights then, if they shine on the child's skin, help break down these waste products that are circulating in the capillaries close to the surface of the skin, and this takes the place of the action of the liver. So, typically though, after several days, the ductus venosus closes and everything is now fine. We've clamped and closed the umbilical arteries and veins. The breathing has closed the ductus arteriosus, and the pressure changes have closed the foramen ovale, and the ductus venosus then closes. The last thing that you should know is that each of these separate elements, these 5 things that we described that cause changes to circulation in the fetus while it's in the womb, they don't disappear. They're all sort of blood vessel type structures. The connective tissues remain, and they each take on different names after birth. For example, we'll look at this list. You see the little yellow boxes there in the diagram. The first one, the ductus arteriosus. It doesn't have any blood flowing in it anymore. It's clamped up. The connective tissues remain, and even in the dissection of an elderly adult, if you examine the aortic arch and the pulmonary trunk, you can find the remnant of that blood vessel that was there at birth. And it is now called the ligamentum arteriosum. Notice how on these ligamentum structures, the arterio ending has been changed to sum to match ligamentum. It was ductus arteriosus. It's now ligamentum arteriosum. Secondly, down the list, the foramen ovale, if it does heal over, which it does in most people, becomes what is called the fossa ovalis. The ductus venosus, in the same pattern as the ductus arteriosus did, becomes the ligamentum venosum. Okay, ligamentum venosum. The umbilical vein, remember this was carrying the oxygen-rich blood, becomes the ligamentum teres. Remember I was telling you that this connective tissue from this ligamentum teres is part of what actually holds the liver up And the connective tissue from that helps hold the liver high up in the abdominal cavity. It's a big, heavy organ, and it doesn't fall and squish your intestines or your other organs in there. Ligamentum teres does that. And then finally, the umbilical arteries, at least the distal, say 2/3 of those, become the lateral umbilical ligaments. And realize in the diagram that it says medial umbilical ligaments. The anatomists that I've talked to that know what they're talking about tell me these are the lateral umbilical ligaments, not the medial umbilical ligaments. So here are the 5 objects and what they become after birth. Just simply connective tissue remnants of what was there during the 9 months that a person spends in its mother's womb. All right? So that is fetal circulation, a very, very important topic. Make sure you've studied it well, that you know what these different bypasses are, what kinds of changes they cause, and what they become after birth.